Hello everyone, welcome to Sunday School class with Ricky. As always, if you are returning, welcome back. I'm so pleased that you have decided to come back to join us again for one of these classes. If this is the first time you are joining, welcome. We trust that you will remain and be part of this class. As always, again, we invite you to please share these videos, like and subscribe, and we will be very grateful if you did that. That would help us to get a lot more views. We have been going through the life of David as found in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel in the Old Testament. At our last class, we described how David eventually became king of all Israel. So now we are at the point where David is king. And for the next few classes, we'll be going through some of the things that David did as he was king. We're calling that the acts of King David. So we'll see some of the things that he did as king. And of course, we're continuing to focus our attention on the fact that through all of these things, we see in David a man with a heart like God's. So let's continue. Let's examine some of the acts of King David. So of course, now that David is king, one of the first things he will want to do is to establish his capital city in Israel. And so David and his men, we're told at the start of 1 Samuel chapter 6, went to a city called Jebus. Jebus was occupied by people called the Jebusites, as you would imagine. And David saw Jebus as a potential location for his capital city. Now you might be thinking to yourself, Jebus, I've never heard about that city before. Well, that's because you probably are more familiar with its more recent name, which is Jerusalem. So Jebus, at the time as it was called, was a well-defended city. This, of course, was one of the reasons why David saw it as being suitable to become his capital city. It was well defended, it was well located. The occupants, the inhabitants, the Jebusites thought that the city was impregnable, and they thought that they could easily defend it. In fact, they said very sarcastically to David and his men that, even the lame and the blind of Jebus could defend the city against David and his men. They were so confident that he couldn't get in. Of course, David was a well-schooled and military man, well-trained in these things, and he observed a way in which the city could be breached or could be gotten into. And he observed that you could get into the city by its water shaft. And so David hit on the plan, and he said to his men that whoever was able to climb through that water shaft and take the city will become chief and captain of his army. First Chronicles tells us, we're not told this specifically in 2 Samuel, but First Chronicles 11 tells us that Joab, who we've mentioned before, was the one who went up first. I guess him and his men, he went up through the water shaft, entered the city, and conquered the city for David, thus cementing his place as commander of the army. It does appear, by the way, that after Joab killed Abner, which we described in the previous class, that he kind of had a falling out of favor with David, and that he was, kind of on the sidelines for a while. But this act of climbing through the water shaft and conquering Jebus for David, that kind of brought him back in favor with David, and it was his chance to redeem himself, and now once again he is chief and commander of David's army. And so David has now conquered Jebus, and the name of the city is now called Jerusalem, the city of David. So now David has his capital city. We are told that David grew stronger and stronger because God was with him. And that's a theme that we'll see throughout this class. God was with him. There was no separation between him and God. And now David has conquered Jerusalem, and thus starts the long and storied history of the city of Jerusalem, which continues to intrigue us up to this day. Now here's a bit of history about Jerusalem. So that event that we just described, where David conquered the city, is estimated to have taken place around 1000 BC. David captured the city, making it the political capital, the political center of a united Israel. Around 966 BC, David's son Solomon constructed the first temple, cementing the city's role as the religious center, the religious heart of Israel. After the kingdom split, Jerusalem remained the capital of Judah until Nebuchadnezzar II conquered it in 586 BC. He destroyed the temple and he exiled many inhabitants of Jerusalem off to Babylon. That would be people like Daniel and his three friends and Ezekiel, and those people were exiled from Jerusalem and taken as captives to Babylon. In 539 BC, Cyrus the Great rose to power in Persia, and he allowed the Jews to return and rebuild the city of Jerusalem. And this ushered in what is called the Second Temple period, because they rebuilt the temple there under Ezra as well. Later on, in 332 BC, Alexander the Great annexed Jerusalem during his wide conquering of that part of the world at the time. And after him, after the breakup of the Greek Empire, Jerusalem was ruled by the Ptolemaic, the Seleucid, and the Hasmonean dynasties. That would be the Egyptians, the Syrians, and then the Jewish Maccabean dynasty. That's what those dynasties refer to. Eventually, Rome took over, and under Roman rule, King Herod the Great, who you have no doubt heard of, he massively expanded the city and also the temple complex, which is why it was later called Herod's Temple. And Herod lived, of course, from 37 to 4 BC. The history of the city continued, and notably around 30 AD, Jesus was crucified there. We don't know the exact year, of course, but estimated to be around 30 AD. In 70 AD, the Roman forces under General Titus razed the temple and destroyed the city during the First Jewish-Roman War. After that, the city became a major center of Eastern Christianity under different Byzantine emperors. In 637 AD, Muslim armies took Jerusalem, inaugurating successive Arab caliphates that ruled over the city. Then the Crusaders came in 1099 and took over the city, but they were only to be defeated by Saladin in 1187, who then recaptured it, of course. After that, we had the Ottoman rule from 1516 all the way up to 1917. And that was a period of relative stability. And then we have the British mandate over Israel, and then ultimately the establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1948. That year, there was a war which split Jerusalem between Israel to the west and Jordan to the east, until Israel once again reunited Jerusalem in 1967 during the Six-Day War. And so we come to today, where the city continues to be in our news day after day, and it remains a focal point of religious devotion and geopolitical contention. So now David is settled in his capital city. He is king. Things are going well. And of course, things had to be disrupted at some point. In 2 Samuel chapter 5, from verses 17 to 25, we see the Philistines now getting involved here. Now, when David was initially made king over the tribe of Judah, as we discussed in our previous class, I guess the Philistines weren't too concerned about that. Hey, he's a king over one tribe. Who cares? What can he do? He can't really bother us just controlling one tribe. But now, David is king over all the tribes. He's the king over all Israel. So now the Philistines will see him as being a formidable foe and someone to be worried about. And indeed, they are worried. So we're told there, in 2 Samuel 5, that the Philistines come up and they bring themselves in array and form an attack against David and against Israel. David, as he usually does the right thing. He consults with God first of all. He asks God, what should I do? Should I go up and confront and fight the Philistines directly? And God says to him, yes, go and fight them directly. Just go up and fight them directly. I will be with you. I will deliver them into your hands. And of course, that is precisely what happened. David went up, he and his army, and God defeated the Philistines, and they were significantly routed, and they fled. And we're told quite almost humorously there in chapter 5 and verse 21, that the Philistines fled, leaving their images, leaving their gods behind. And those gods were taken by the Israelites and of course destroyed. But they fled, they left their gods because they were scared. And they abandoned their gods in flight. That's kind of amusing, but also kind of sad to think that what pathetic gods it was that they were serving. That they had to carry their gods and then flee and leave their gods behind. That's really pathetic. No offense to any Philistines who is watching this video, but that's really pathetic gods that they were serving. And so they're defeated. But if there's one thing you can say about the Philistines, they don't give up easily. So they come up again the second time. They went back, wiped their tears and healed their wounds and whatever, and came back the second time once again to attack. And we're told that they gathered in a place called the Valley of Rephaim, and again come out in array against Israel, against David. Again, David does the right thing. David consults with God and says to God, what should I do? Now, if this was me, and probably you as well, you may have said, the last time this happened, God said to go up against them, so I'll just go up against them now without even bothering to ask God. That's probably what I would have done. But that's not what David did. David, a heart like God's, he knew that on each occasion it was important for him to seek God's guidance. And he did that in this case. And it turns out it was a good thing to do because God said, no, don't go up directly. Go and make a little detour behind them. Come up behind them and then wait for my signal. That's what God told David. So that's what he did. That's what David did. He and his army went up. They made a little detour behind the Philistines and waited for God's signal. And God gave the signal, which was that when you hear the sound of marching in the trees, in the mulberry trees, then attack. And they waited. They heard the sound of marching. They attacked. And once again, the Philistines were defeated. This is a very important lesson for us here to remember. And we're not to assume that we're to do the same thing all the time and that God wants us to do the same thing each time. We should be sure to be like David. Always consult God first. Who knows? The plan might change. And if the plan changes, we need to know that. And so we need to consult with God as David did. And so he did it here again. And once again, resulted in tremendous victory over the Philistines yet again. Okay, so now the Philistines have been defeated. And David turns his attention to doing something which he considered to be very important, which is to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. And you'll recall that the Ark of the Covenant was this symbol that kind of symbolized God's presence with Israel, and it was seen as something that David saw it as something he had to do to bring it to Jerusalem, to kind of see it as a uniting force for the people. He wants people to be brought together and be united by having the Ark there at Jerusalem. And that would become the central location for worship for the Israelites. So the Ark was seen as being symbolizing God's presence. And while the ark was away from the city, it was as though God was not present, as though God has separated himself from them. Of course, that's not true. God was always with them, but they saw it as the ark as representing God's presence, so they wanted the ark to be with them in their central location for worship, which was now Jerusalem. Right? So David saw it as important to take the ark from where it was and bring it to the city. Now the ark was presently located in a place called Kirjath Jearim, in the house of a man called Aminadab. And so David went out, he and his men, his followers, to get the ark from there and to bring it back to Jerusalem. The ark, we're told in the book of Numbers, was to be transported in a particular way, and it was to be handled only by the Kohathites, the descendants of Kohath. That way, that they were supposed to use poles to insert the poles that were in the rings of the ark and transport it in that manner. Certainly, the ark was not supposed to be transported by putting it on a cart, whether that cart was new or otherwise. But that's what David and his men did. They got this brand new, pristine cart, straight off of the parking lot. They brought it. It was nice in new condition and everything, and they put the ark on it to transport it, which was not the correct way. But that's what they did. And so they got the ark, they put it on the cart, and they're now heading back to the city. And there's a huge celebration, lots of dancing and music, I guess, and all of these kind of wonderful things, celebrating the return of the ark, or the removal of the ark to the city. And of course, what they would see as the return of God's presence with them. And so they're traveling. And then something happened. There was a man called Uzzah, and he was one of the men who was escorting the cart. And he was walking behind the cart, and as they got to a certain location, the oxen who were pulling the cart stumbled, the ark teetered and started to fall, and here was Uzzah having to make a split-second decision. Because Uzzah would have known that God said he was not to touch the ark. But in his mind, the ark is about to fall to the ground, into the dirt. How can you have God's nice ark falling into the dirt? And so all these thoughts probably going through Uzzah's mind in a split second, and he had to make a decision. Unfortunately, Uzzah made the wrong decision, because he'd reached out his hand to touch and to steady the ark to keep it from falling. In doing that, he disobeyed God's direct command, and so, unfortunately, he suffered the consequences of that. And he ultimately died. Now, I think most of us know that story, and we tend to feel somewhat that Uzzah was a bit unfair. He was a bit hard done. He was trying to do a good thing, right? I'm sure some of us feel that, and maybe we feel that it was a bit harsh on him to be judged in that manner. But Uzzah wasn't completely blameless here. He would have had to have known God's command against touching the ark. He knew that. And so in that split second, he, probably with good intentions, but he chose to disobey God's clear command. Probably thinking that he was doing something that was more noble. But that was a mistake. And God indicated, this is the command. You are not to touch the ark, and therefore, as noble as his intentions may have been, suffered the consequences. David, seeing all this, was very displeased and was wondering, how am I going to bring this ark back to Jerusalem? Knowing that it was the right thing to do, however, it had to be done in the right way. And so they took the ark aside and took it to the house of a Philistine, a man called Obed-Edom. And we are told that because of the presence of the ark at Obed-Edom's house, his house was blessed and he became very prosperous and so on because of the presence of the ark there. And it was there for a while. In fact, it was there for about 3 months. And then, so 3 months later, David decided, well, let's try this thing again. And this time, it was done the right way. And yes, again, they brought the ark, much celebrations. David leading the charge, celebrating in front of the ark coming to the city, and eventually it made it to the city safely with lots of celebration. David gave gifts to everyone, and maybe declared it a national holiday or something. We don't know, but they had a good time as the ark was brought successfully back to Jerusalem. We had given there a story about David's wife Michal and her response to seeing David celebrating, but we thought about that before, so that was just one aspect of the story. But generally speaking, it was a time of celebration, a time of joy, and the ark was now safely in Jerusalem. So the task was successfully completed this time. As I was going through today's class, there were a number of thoughts that came to me in terms of what would be a good lesson to take from these different stories. And of course we could talk about any number of things, but one thing caught my attention, which had to do with the presence of God. As mentioned, we know the Ark of the Covenant symbolized God's presence with Israel. And when it was gone, it symbolized as though God had separated himself from Israel. And so the ark being taken to Jerusalem was seen as, God's presence with us. That's how the Israelites would have thought. And then similarly, I thought of that kind of amusing story about when the Philistines fled the battle, having been defeated, and they separated from their gods. They got separated from their gods because they were defeated, and they ran and left their gods. And so they were separated from their gods as well. And of course, when you read that, the thought we have as Christians is that our God isn't like that. We can't run and flee and leave our God behind, because our God is everywhere, and of course we can't run and leave him behind or any such thing. He is always with us. And similarly with the Ark of the Covenant, God was always with his people. And today, he is always with us. There is no separation between us and God. There is no battle that can cause us to flee and leave God behind. There's no place that God's presence would be that we are not. And so there's no separation between us as Christians, as God's people, and our God. And that is a comforting thought. There's no place that you can be, whether it be a physical place or even an emotional or mental state that you could be in, that God has separated himself from you, or God has forsaken you. God has said, he'll never leave us nor forsake us. And of course, there's that wonderful passage in Romans chapter 8, from verse 35 onwards, where it asks, who can separate us, or what can separate us from the love of God? And then Paul lists a number of things, and just to say, none of these things can separate us from God. And so we have the assurance that there is nothing that can separate us from God. And that's a great and a comforting thought. No war, no circumstance, no disease, nothing can separate us from God. And that's my word of comfort to you today as a Christian. And as always, my word of challenge to those of you who may be watching who are not yet Christians, there is a way for you as well to experience that same hope, that same comfort and assurance of no separation from God. And that is through his Son, Jesus Christ. And you trust in him as your Savior, and you too can have that relationship, that assurance, that peace, that comfort of knowing God, a God who never leaves you nor forsakes you. And so we've seen this first part of the acts of King David. We saw his heart, once again, a heart like God's, desiring to be with God and having God's presence with him. We'll continue to do so in our next class as well. Some more acts of King David. Some more ways we see how his heart is like God's heart. And we trust that these will continue to be a blessing to you. So join us for our next class. Until then, may God bless you.